Okay, I'd like to say welcome to everyone who's attending this webinar at this moment. I'm sure there's more going to be coming on as we progress, but thanks very much for coming along to our monthly, hopefully monthly webinars we'll be running on organisational resilience. As you can see, the Resilience Organisation supports various charities, and really we're behind in more than many charities at the moment, but certainly Mind, because of the mental health issues that we're seeing around us. So Gary, can we move on to the next slide, please? What I'm looking to do is really just give you a quick update on where we are with the Resilience Association. We are moving towards formally launching the Resilience Association. I mean, so far we have several thousand potential members who've registered on our website. And if you haven't, we would ask you to please register on our website as we move forward as the Resilience Association. You know, our key aims are here, our vision, our mission, our strategic goal. As an organisation, we're a fledgling organisation, but we have been around for quite some time under previously the name of Business and National Government, or BANG as it was. And we've moved forward now because we feel with the events that were happening before, are happening now, and continue to happen as we move forward in our particular different professions, as you can see on this slide, that we together need to come as one body and represent the resilience industry as is. And we have several other particular areas we'd like to develop further, certainly in special interest groups, and specifically with our Women in Resilience Exchange, which has met before, and also our supply chain management and communications. So if you are interested in registering with the Resilience Association, and keeping yourselves updated about what we're doing, please go to www.resilienceassociation.org, and there you can see information on the Resilience Association. Plus, at the same time, we ask you to leave your contact details so we can keep in communication with you. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. This is really as a build-up to the great presentations I hope you'll find from today. From my point of view, we really need to stay focused on COVID-19, but there's a lot of things that have been happening behind the scenes which really need to be, we need to keep in touch with them. You know, sometimes big events cover or put a cover on other events that are happening. And obviously we can start seeing events which are affecting the financial security of organizations, through to major fires, in this case, one that affected communication centers right across Europe. And at the same time, big issues with our transportation at a time when goods are we're having difficulty getting goods between countries. You know, these type of things make major events, and certainly with the communication issues. Again, the increase in cyber events, not least in through this game called Dark Side, and the types of events that are then leading to major ransomware attacks, especially one particular one being the US fuel pipeline, Colonial Pipeline. In that particular case, that also impacted on air transport as well as vehicles on the ground. And again, I come back to mental health issues. You know, it's one of the biggest events that we will see as companies come back to this new normal. Organizations need to really focus on their staff and the state those staff are in following some unprecedented events that we've been through altogether. Go next slide, please, Gary. These slides will be available on our website in the coming week or so. But what I will say to you is we need to start looking at how we've got to this world of organizational resilience. Back in 2014, the British Standards Institute issued BS65000. And some of us on this webinar are actually working towards an update of this particular standard. But as you can see, we need to have some clear definitions about the subject matter we're talking about. And this is as clear as we're going to get just at this time. But I do point people towards the World Economic Forum and a particular paper they wrote in 2016 on the fourth industrial revolution. And again, it talks about key terms here, leadership, a leadership paradigm, and in turbulent times, the effects that can happen, an unprecedented change that is going ahead, not least with communications. And that's why I point back to the previous slide on the impacts on the cloud network, on organizations we've outsourced to third parties. We need to keep that in our sights. An interesting report was produced together with the British Standards Institution and Cranfield School of Management. And they asked some key questions here. And I'd ask you to ask your own organizations these same questions. Why are some organizations more successful, in coping with and responding to the complexity, volatility and uncertainty of the current business environment? This is 2017. Obviously, the events we've been through and are going through now, really bring this to the top of the pile, I'd suggest. Why some organizations facing adversity focus on the negative, whilst others successfully seize the opportunity to adapt and change? And as a leader, what more could you do to ensure organizational resilience for your business? And we're starting off today with one of 5 particular webinars that we're going to be running. This first one is going to be focused on the cultural issues that go with it. And the International Organization for Standardization, in their resilience vocabulary, they see this as being the collective beliefs, values, attitudes, and behavior of an organization that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment in which it operates. There's a lot in there, and we're going to try and unravel this within the next 50 minutes that we have left here today. And what I'd ask anyone to do, if we can move to the next slide, please, Gary. Could you please, make well use of the chat facility here, so that if you have any questions, we try and answer them as we go through, but at the very end, we'll raise questions that I feel are relevant to all parties who are on this call. So please, use the chat facility, and if you have any questions, put them through that capability. So, over to you now. Please go on the next slide. Okay, Paul, slight change here, but Paul, can you please take over and run your presentation, sir?
Thanks, Steve, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from the United States. Hope everybody's doing well. And in my years of experience, I worked for a number of big companies, and I never thought much about it, but there was a definite culture within the organization, you pretty much had to sort of agree with the culture to survive. So in my remarks, I'm going to be talking about where am I here? We're moving around.
Yeah, can we, Gary, where are you with this, please? Thanks. Thank you very much. Okay, Paul, please carry on.
Okay, yeah. Okay, next slide, Gary, please. Okay, back on track. We'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of a culture that embraces resilience. We'll ask some questions about what's needed to build that, the importance of getting top management and employees on board. We'll talk a little bit about the partners needed to create a resilience culture. And then we'll also take a moment and just ask a few questions about, what is it from a reality perspective? Next slide, please. From my perspective, having worked for a number of big companies and then translating that into the resilience perspective, it's very important for everybody within the organization, employees as well as top management, to understand everything that's associated with resilience. So a certain amount of awareness and training needs to be done to make sure that people understand what resilience is all about. Everything that the business does should, if possible, be supported with what we call a resilience shield. And that's essentially designing business processes, services, anything that the organization does so that it can, it can continue to operate if some sort of a disruptive event takes place. And that can be anything as simple as ensuring that all the data associated with a particular service is backed up, ensuring that the technology that supports particular business activities are replicated somewhere else, and even to the point where working remotely is available and readily available to employees at a moment's notice, which we've seen quite a bit over the last year. And then the important thing is to ask if anything that we do within the organization will ensure that we can continue to operate. And as it says at the bottom, an attitude of resilience forms the foundation for everything the company does. Now that's an important starting point here. Next slide, please. As I mentioned in the previous one, understanding and awareness of the issues associated with resilience is important. Whoever is responsible for building and creating this culture, needs to communicate information on a regular basis about the importance, the value of resilience. Needless to say, we all understand, and I'm sure agree, that top management support and commitment is very important to making sure any of this works. To make sure that you can actually do and build a culture of resilience is to have a plan. I like to think in terms of an evolutionary plan, and one that has a clear end vision, so that there's an end game, if you will. And then finally, and this is probably the most important part of it, ongoing reinforcement of all the resilience issues, and more importantly, how they can continue to support how the business operates. Next slide, please. We've all gone through the process of trying to encourage and trying to sell top management on the importance of things like business continuity, security, disaster recovery, those kind of things. And the same thing is true with operational and organizational resilience. Top management has to understand the business benefit of adding resilience. And they have to be aware of potential investments, and more importantly, be comfortable with the returns on those future investments. And then the idea of a transition from the current cultural norms to a new culture involves a transition. So the important thing there is to make sure that the transition does not impair the company's ability to do its normal work. And as it says at the bottom, the top management must be convinced of the value and impact of a culture of resilience on all aspects of the building going forward. Next slide. It's important to make sure that in addition to top management, you get everybody else in the organization on board with this idea of a change in the culture. Employees have to understand all the different aspects of resilience and how it impacts their work and their responsibilities. And then taking that to the next step, they have to understand and embrace the value of these particular activities in accordance with the work that they're actually doing. They need to be assured that what they're doing, especially by adding resilience attributes to their work, is going to add value. And then they have to understand that there's going to be some sort of a transition, and all the while keeping a focus on the end game, what the end results are going to be. And as it says at the bottom, top management support is number one, but understanding how the work experience can be improved is also very important. Next slide, please. Well, besides top management, as you can say, other departments within an organization can become key partners. There's a couple of examples, like human resources, probably a very pivotal partner in doing something like this, but public relations, marketing, and even legal can also be key supporters. It may also be relevant to engage the services of external organizations, such as consultancy firms, who have experience in working with organizations to enable changes to their corporate culture. But of course, it takes all employees to make this work. And as it says, everybody should be invested with the desire to establish a culture of resilience. Next slide. As I was doing this, I'm thinking to myself, but wait a minute, there's got to be a downside, or there's got to be a point where we got to just say, whoa, hold on a second. And having worked for a number of very large organizations myself, as I'm sure many of you have, it's not easy for older, larger, and well-established companies to make any kinds of major cultural shifts. As you might imagine, it's going to be much easier for smaller and more agile firms to do that. They may have less than 100 employees, or maybe less than 50 employees. So, making cultural changes is probably going to be a lot easier. Let's face it. In spite of all the best intentions, cultural change might not happen. So be prepared to accept that possibility. One of the things I've seen that sometimes can work is to make changes, but what I would call bite-sized pieces. Smaller activities that are more contained, and at the conclusion of each activity, there's kind of a review and reinforcement of what happens before starting on the next phase. And then the last bullet here was, you have people in place at the top who may be very supportive, but if they change, if somebody retires or moves on or changes jobs, the new people coming in may not be as interested in a cultural change. So it may change or end any of those efforts. So as I said in the bottom, no guarantees that a culture of resilience is possible or even likely. Next slide. Okay, so all right, so we talked about the kinds of things that go into establishing a culture of resilience. And we've also said, well, it might not happen. But all that aside, let's think in terms of, like, what do we do now? Obviously, you want to set up a plan, some kind of a plan over a period of time to establish a culture of resilience with some sort of an end game. Identify and quantify the values, and especially the benefits for the company by adopting this approach. Make sure that top management is briefed on the plan regularly, and again, this is important to continue to secure their endorsement and support. Once you get all this approved, get the plan started, and keep at it. There may be setbacks along the way, but keep at it. Diligence is very important. And then another important thing is to regularly demonstrate how the plan is working. Identify any kinds of benefits that have been demonstrated through the cultural change. And again, this is not only to employees, but also to top management. So everyone in the company, no matter what level, has to be committed to creating a culture of resilience. That's the only way you can really make this happen. So next slide, and that'll conclude my remarks, and turn it back over to Gary for our next speaker. Thank you all.
Thanks, Gary. Next slide, please. Hi, so I'm Aaron Gracie, and I'm just going to give you a quick canter through organizational resilience. What is it and what does it do? So if you look at the last 18 months, we've had a number of challenges to the resilience of organizations. If we just pull out one, COVID, for example, it has been an element that has really challenged organizations across the globe. In the space of 4 months, it went from being an outbreak of a disease in China to a global pandemic. And the figures are quite scary when you look at it. We've had over 168.5 million cases across the globe, with over 3.5 million deaths. If we focus in on the UK, we're looking at 3.5 million cases with about 128,000 deaths. So one of the highest death rates, if not the highest death rate in Europe alone. And when we look at that financially, the figures aren't much better reading either. In 2020, we saw the GDP of the UK take a nosedive of 11.3%, a drop not seen since 1921 depression. And in 2021, the forecast is about a 5.5% bounce back. So actually, there is a large amount of productivity that has been lost in the UK. Now, if we then look across the US, in October 2020, we had people writing, researchers writing in the Journal of the Academic Medicine Association Journal, the JAMA, that indicated that in their assessment from October 2020, if COVID lasted for 1 year, it would cost the American economy $16 trillion. 90% of the US's GDP for a year. So COVID has significantly impacted on the resilience of organizations. So the key question here is, what is resilience? We talk about organizational resilience. It's a buzzword people are using, but what is it? So let's look at that in a bit more detail. Gary, next slide, please. So we're dealing with a VUCA world. Now, the VUCA, the word the American military has termed, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It is the environment we find ourselves in now, the new normal. It is not a business-friendly environment. Now, the UK military, looking at future plans through their strategic trends analysis through MOD think tanks, have also coined the 5 Cs, looking at the future operating environment, which is congested, cluttered, contested, connected, and constrained. For businesses, we need to be aware of this because this is the new normal. This is the environment that we are operating within. And we've got to be really aware of understanding what black swans are, but also what creeping tides are. And together, organizations must plan, understand, react, adapt, and learn how to attend and deal with these. Okay? Both academics and business analysts have agreed that there is no going back. This is the new normal, and we need to understand how to live in it. Next slide, please, Guy. So what happens when an organization goes through a disruptive event? Well, this graph clearly shows it. So we have organizations operating at BAU, and on the left, you see their performance capability and time of the event on the bottom. As it's transiting through, it hits a disruptive event, and it will drop down to its baseline resilience capability. All organizations have a resilience capability based on its knowledge, experience, longevity of staff, processes, number. The better the planning, the smaller that resilience gap we see on the left side. However, a disruptive event will push you down to where your resilience capability will take you to. As we go through immediate response, crisis management, incident response, then moving into business continuity, and then moving into our recovery mode, we start to learn. And as you can see on the bottom, we have that green line showing that we're starting to learn from our operational experience, but we're learning the hard way. The recovery piece may get us up to almost BAU. However, there will be a change in the environment. Our stakeholders may have lost faith in us. The banks may have lost faith in us. We may have lost market shares. Our competitors may have got march on us. We may never get back to where we were before the disruptive event. However, there is something we can do to address this. If we do a proper lessons learned, understanding what happened and why, then we can create an organizational learning, building this culture that feeds into the culture of resilience. And when we do that, we increase our knowledge, we shorten our resilience gap, we get a resilience improvement. The lessons learned will also give us a performance improvement because we'll know what went wrong. We know what we missed in our risk assessment and our information gathering, and we can address it. We can put in better practices and procedures. We can educate our staff. We get a performance improvement. But that's only if we have a learning culture underpinning our resilience. Next slide, please, Guy. And these are a few definitions from right across the globe. We have Cranfield University, BS65000, the UK's organisational resilience standard. We also have from Australia, from New Zealand, ResOrgs, which has been an academic group looking at this for many years, and also the Australian government. I've highlighted in red the key points that we need to think about. However, I would challenge, very few there actually think about people. There's little about learning lessons, talent management, focusing on the human aspect of the organization. Yet it's the people that give us the agility. It's the people that create and manage the culture. And it's the people that help the organization adapt and survive when hit with a disruptive event. And yet very few of these definitions really concentrate on people. Therefore, I would redefine organizational resilience as the following. Next slide, please, Gary. And based on my PhD work, I've identified it as this. It's a people-centered activity. It requires strategic coordination and adaptive leadership. It requires shared situational awareness, but it's underpinned by that learning culture, creating positive adjustment adaptation. Now, why are all these in red? Because these are the ones that are the gift of the C-suite, the senior leadership, to deliver. And this is where we build this culture of resilience. But it's got to start from the top, and it's got to be embedded, and everyone's got to be empowered to believe it. Okay, next slide, please. And as this model grows, you'll see what is on the left-hand side is the gift of the organizational leadership to give a vision, a culture, the leadership piece. And on the right-hand side are all the various structures that we can build around it. Now, this organizational resilience management structure, or ORMS, can actually pull it together, build it, and create an organization that's adaptive, that learns, and can survive and thrive within this VUCA world. Okay? But we've got to be aware of that. But what does all this mean? This is a nice concept, a nice model. How do we put it into practice? Next slide, please, Gary. So this is what we're looking at as a maturity model, and for me, the ORM3. And here we have the model in the top right-hand corner and the strategic core, the key bits. Okay? However, wrapped around that are all our assurance, agility, planning, structures, governance, and business development elements. And all these components come together. And this helps create a resilience framework within the organization. It's not just one, two things. It's not business continuity or incident management. It's not risk management. It's a blend of everything. And this is where we're getting it wrong. Too many organizations focus on the business agility or the assurance and agility, the risk management, business continuity, incident management, crisis management, and recovery. The ones on the right, the business development, tend to get forgotten about. Yet they are the ones that will enable all the other elements to happen. And this is where we need to actually try and adjust the balance a bit. Next slide, please, Gary. So if you can click once, Gary, for me, and again. So here we got, this is the core, and here's the frameworks around it, building the capability of an organization. Now, wrapped around this, next clip, are the values. And this goes back to what Paul highlighted about building the culture, the values of that organization. And again, please, Gary. And then around that, we have the behaviors, what we're going to see our people demonstrate, how the organization is going to behave with others and stakeholders. Next clip, please, Gary. All that information gathering, turning it into business intelligence, understanding our environment, understanding the VUCA world we're living in. Next clip, please, Gary. Okay. And then building our frameworks. And finally, Gary, next clip. And then our activities. So when we pull that together, that makes a very nice conceptual model. But what does it look like in real life? Next slide, please, Gary. Okay. So we're going to look at this now as the sunburst model, for want of a better description. Okay. And ORMS provides a framework to help navigate the environment. But it uses business intelligence to understand the complexity, to help build strategic agility. To do this, we empower our workforce, and we've got to build effective change management mechanisms. We're going through change. A disruptive event forces change. We need to adapt and do it under control. But to do that, we need a shared vision. Understand where we're going, our beginning and our end state. We've got to think disruptively, understand how these environments will happen. Major disruptive events will create Gordian knots, which we need to unpick. However, whatever action we do may have an opposite and equal reaction. We will never have the perfect answer. We'll just have what works right now. And then, the situation will morph again. And then around that, we need to develop the operational activities to deliver the strategic principles of organizational resilience. And taking the model we previously spoke about and putting it into actual physical examples, which we'll do this now. So next click, please, Gary. Okay, so here again, we'll have the strategic element, our leadership vision and our culture. And again, please, Gary, and building around it what we're looking to do in the organization. Build, empower, understand, adapt, and thrive. Next slide, please, Gary. Here now, we start seeing our values, what we're looking for in the organization. And around that, next slide, we want to see our behaviors. So this is what we're looking at people to be, or how our business operates. And again, please, Gary. Okay. Now we start looking where we get our intelligence, our information from, our business intelligence, our red teaming, horizon scanning, environmental awareness. Again, please, Guy. Now here's our resilience frameworks, our corporate security, our policy, stakeholder management, resource management, risk and assurance, governance and planning, and our information management. Okay. And then finally, wrapped around all that are our activities. Now that is what you should be looking at in an organization. We've taken the strategic organizational resilience and mapped it out to operational resilience activities. Few organizations are currently thinking like that. And we only have to look at the reports coming out from Cranfield University earlier this year. Okay, from the World Economic Forum in 2019. We can go back further to the PwC 2017. And what about even going further back? You had Steve, he worked on a review with the Liverpool University back in 2010. But this is where we need to get to. This requires a serious shift in cultural thinking from the C-suite downwards. Okay, next slide, Gary. Okay, and how do we deal with the VUCA world? We create a clear vision, clear understanding, we build agility, and we use the clarity of environmental awareness through the intelligence we've gathered to build our operational and our organizational resilience frameworks. So thank you very much. Questions, I believe, will be at the end. I'll hand over to our next speaker.
Right, hello everybody. Can I start off by saying it's an absolute pleasure to follow other speakers who actually are all on the same sheet. Sometimes in conferences you get people who don't always say the same things that add up. This is not one of those occasions. It's great that everyone's in harmony. Now I've got 12 minutes just to speak about what it says on the screen. It's time to move from silos to synergy and to grasp the difference that separates all organizations as either robust or risky or resilient. Now I'm going to leave this slide on for a moment because something happened yesterday morning, certainly across this country, and I think probably elsewhere. We were treated to a heaven-sent opportunity to listen to someone go on about what happens when a crisis occurs and there is no resilience. Now, we don't know for sure whether the person speaking was speaking entirely truthfully, but he said it with a degree of compassion. I'm referring to somebody called Dominic Cummings, who was a very senior position in the UK cabinet when COVID-19 first hit and continued to develop in the months afterwards. Cummings said a number of things, and I just want to pick out just one or two which are going to resonate because it was, as I said, an opportunity to listen to someone give a shopping list of what not to do. He said, "We had no plan." Indeed, the deputy director of the Cabinet Office admitted it, no plan. Why? In 2017, there was a risk register survey carried out by the government that said COVID was the most highest threat and the risk of it happening was extremely high. But sometimes it's easier to forget that and ignore it. And that's what I'm afraid largely happened. The horizon scanning was carried out, but it never led to a coordinated plan that joined up all the silos of government. Human nature got in the way. He said, look, another point, he said, it's a classic example of groupthink when everybody was trying their best to get some sort of consensus, some sort of harmony in number 10 Downing Street. And that was elusive. It wasn't happening. Nobody, he felt, was challenging what people were trying to say because they would be seen as, don't you want consensus? Don't you want harmony? Well, I think most of us listening to this will be aware when you have groupthink and no one challenges, that could be disastrous. And the third point I just wanted to draw out of this account of an ongoing crisis. Cummings referred to there was no accountability. Everybody was pointing here and there and everything else. Now, I interpret that as some meetings have become the mechanism for the avoidance of responsibility. There was no real structure from what he said, at least. And I think no united plan, at the end of the day, really comes down to just too many silos. So for me, resilience, and I want to explain this more in a minute, is really a combination of three things. It is the operational risk, essentially before, crisis management, essentially at, and business continuity, essentially recovery. Put that into one pot, not just joined up, but one entity. And in my opinion, we need directors of resilience at board level. And in my opinion, we need a minister for resilience in this country. Right, next slide, please. Now, I mentioned before this thing about your organization being robust, risky, or resilient. Let me spend a minute talking about what that means to me. Thank you, Gary. A robust organization, total resistance to all types of pressures, and nothing likely is going to impact us. There's no need to change any corporate behavior. What are the downsides? Well, rigid. Okay, Gary, put it up. Downside, rigid, inflexible, impervious to change. Culturally, organizations like this can be, not all, but they can often be, cultures where it's very hard to admit that something didn't work well. Whistleblowers are demonized. Their pride in being robust is almost the opposite of what Aaron was talking about, a learning culture. What about risky organizations? Thank you, Gary. Those organizations that are unable to withstand any pressures without having to make fundamental changes or structures, otherwise they'd collapse. Downside of that is obvious. Thank you, Gary. They're vulnerable, susceptible, and exposed. I tend to think the majority of organizations that don't have any sense of resilience probably fall into that category rather than just being too robust. But what about those organizations that are in fact resilient? Thank you, Gary. Those are able to absorb pressures. They can adapt, reform quickly without destabilizing, and very much the lessons identified, learned, and applied. What happens in terms of the benefits? They are sustainable, durable, adaptive, and agile. Next, can you put that? Agile is very important, which is why I put a little circle around that. And what do I mean by agile organizations? Well, let's peel one layer back. Gary, next slide, please. Why agile? Let's have a look at some of the factors that impinge on all organizations, public and private. What are the external factors? Well, there are many. Here are some. The uncharted post-Brexit landscape, COVID impacting and ongoing. I've referred to it. Every speaker has referred to it. Ethical consumerism. So many consumers, certainly when we look at what we call Generation Z, that I'll come to in a moment, aren't just content in getting products without knowing the ethics and the position of the company supplying them. Confused horizons. When we look at PESTEL, most of us are familiar with that one, the political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal. Those are confused horizons at the moment as a combination principally of COVID and Brexit. What about the internal factors? Well, too many business models are now thought to be unsustainable in this brave new landscape as we go through 2021. A landscape for business and all operations that's unparalleled since the end of World War II. Home working, the consequences of that. Steve has already referred to the mental health of many workers that have impacted negatively by working from home. That's just one issue. Generation Z, the generation of those who Zoom or zombies, as they're some kind called, are really those people born after 2005 who have no real memory of anything that happened before the disasters of 9/11. These people are obviously quite young. They are the workforce and they are also the product consumers of a lot of what people do, but they have largely underdeveloped social skills, to be honest, and they are sort of digital natives in another way, and they're often risk averse. However, Generation Z, that generation coming on now, are very quizzical about ethical issues. The days of just producing stuff without talking about anything greening, meaning it have gone. So these are just two of the issues, two bundles. But if we go on to the next slide, if we now just look at this in terms of not just internal, external, but also technical, economic, as well as down to people social. So we've got 4 quadrants. And I'm putting these up because they come to a single conclusion, in my opinion. Next slide there, Gary. If we look on the left, internal, technical, product service defects, industrial failures, defective information, and so on. Internal also, failures to adapt. Let's remember that when Charles Darwin talked about the origin of the species, everybody quotes it as survival of the fittest. I think we all know Darwin talked about it is those who are unable to adapt and change will not survive. Organizational breakdowns. I talked about here again, Generation Z, hundreds, thousands, millions of young people who only know the digital age have transformed a great deal. Miscommunication and risk-averse culture. Okay, Gary, next one. And then look on the external side of it, the post-Brexit turbulence, cyber terrorism. Well, cyber terrorism is particularly interesting because Steve mentioned this a little bit earlier on. We are having issues now. Phishing attacks, of course, are quite common to steal sensitive data. We're looking at malware, spyware, ransomware, denial of service attacks. Recent examples of some of this, Irish healthcare, would you believe? The solar winds attack in the USA, which penetrated several government organizations. And of course, the US pipeline was subject to this. And I believe, if I'm right, there's a story going that a £5 million ransom was paid to get out of that one. So carrying on that little box there, large-scale system failures, stretched brittle supply chains, and then external people, hostile media betrayal, COVID mutating, confused horizons, I've already mentioned that, the political, environmental, and so on, false rumors, slanders. All of these crisis factors hit the entire company. They do not just hit silos. These span far beyond that, and they deal with the most critical issue, reputation. Okay, Gary, next one, please. So leading through the crisis, Agile came up. Other speakers have mentioned it. Aaron mentioned it. For me, it's extremely important. Agile leadership, for example, is a very, very important concept. Sadly, we don't have time to actually unpack that completely. Decision makers might have to choose the least bad solution and resolve fundamental dilemmas. This means that in a crisis, that every choice comes with a penalty. There's no ideal solution. When I and a few others wrote the British Guide or the Standard on Crisis Management, these are extracts from it. Gary, next slide. If we put this into some little framework here, like a spider diagram, when we go into the crisis phase as a key ingredient of resilience, but not the only thing in resilience, if you look, for example, what you're doing, is it going to be corporate in terms of impact, departmental? Is the speed versus accuracy and so on? Wrestling with that and solving it is the key to me for dealing with a crisis. It's the one thing I'm afraid you seldom see. Next slide, Gary. So to wind this up, let's just have a look at this key point for me. I'm going to come back to crisis management, not because I think it's the be all or end all, but to me, when things happen, and I think we're going to have more dramas than less as we go through the next few years, what are the recurring questions that reveal whether resilience is true or not? What do we know? What don't we know? What would we like to know? How long before the press call us? How much will this damage our reputation? But the problems are this. Next, Gary. Decision-making barriers. You put those up, Gary. Complacency, can't see, won't see. Perseveration, that is doing something that makes it worse. Too many silos because can't cope. Panic, overwhelmed, extreme stress, which takes me right back to the beginning of my short session. That is what somebody in central government said happened, sadly, when COVID first hit the UK. But I must stress, we don't know how truthful and honest he was, but what he said was very interesting nonetheless. Next slide, Gary. So thank you very much for my input. Hope it made sense, and I think now under Steve's tutelage, we'll have some questions and answers. So thank you.
No, thanks very much, Peter. It's welcome the points you've raised there and everything. But could I ask the speakers all come back on video, please? That's great. Thanks to each of you there. But we had some questions raised, been sent directly to myself here. And I'm going to start the reverse wave around, if you don't mind. Peter, one of the questions I've had raised is, what are the most effective triggers that can improve operational resilience?
I think one of the key ones is looking at what's happening at that time. You look at situational awareness and so many issues such as horizon scanning. Your neighbor, a rival organization, has suddenly been hit by the same cyber attack. They've suddenly fallen over because the brittle supply chains have broken. There's suddenly been a reputational damage simply because of miscommunication and poor PR. So some of the key triggers are near misses. And you either let the near misses not become lessons to learn, you just go, oh, thank God it didn't happen to us. But if you learn from that, back to points that Aaron, I think, was making, if you have that learning culture and one can recognize that, learn the lessons, adapt and carry on, so much the better. But look out for the things that were near misses. All too often, they are forgotten about.
Okay, thanks, Peter, on that one. Yeah, Aaron, got one for you here. We have heard a lot about organizational operational resilience. So organizational operational resilience. Are these the same thing, or have we created two different disciplines within an organization?
Cheers, thanks. Gary, can I actually just flip back to my sunburst model while I discuss, if possible? And the reason I highlight it is, there has been a concern that operational resilience and organizational resilience were, two things that were same element. Well, I completely disagree, because actually, your organizational resilience is the strategic thinking, building the concepts and the principles, understanding what you need to deliver. Okay? Whereas your operational resilience, all the activities around this here, is actually doing the activities to build that capability. And the real challenge for people is you have operational resilience, which are the tasks, strategic resilience, which is your long-term planning, the vision, culture, adaptive leadership, and then the various, as I've put around here, your operational resilience framework, which comes from your organizational thinking. The challenge that we are seeing within C-suite, it's you're asking 5, 10, 15 years of thinking down the line. Most C-suite are lasting 5, 6 years best before they move on. So the strategic long-range thinking isn't happening. And because that long-term thinking, that strategic organizational resilience isn't happening, the operational resilience frameworks and activities aren't being put in place. Or if they are, they're being done in silos. And you'll have someone over here doing business continuity, and in the same organization, and I've seen it, the same organization, the risk management team, do not talk to the organizational resilience, to the business continuity team. Yet business continuity requires the information from the risk team to understand the impact of the risk. And yet these two aren't speaking. So if that's happening in these domains which are supportive of each other, what on earth is happening when you're looking at HR, research, innovation, and that element which builds your resilience, but it's completely independent of your corporate security activities. So no, they're not the same thing. One is your long-term thinking, development, and future-proofing. The other one is actually doing the stuff to build the capability. I don't know if Peter or Paul think on that one.
Yeah, I'm with you, Gary. I think you're, sorry, Aaron, if you look at your diagram, which I'm sure most people are, that requires a lot of reading. I have to say, I think you've captured an awful lot there and all the very, very good points. It's interesting that we're talking today, this afternoon in the UK at least, as most of us have alluded to, there's a crisis that is ongoing and it'll be followed by another crisis and yet another. And yet by operational risk management, you should be able to look at the risk radar. And when you look at a risk radar, people shouldn't be looking for great big flashing lights. In my opinion, they should be looking at clusters of lights on the risk radar. Any one of those lights that blink might be considered insignificant, but it's when they all happen at the same time or similar time that they transform to one crisis which actually will expand and expand. But too many people would, to quote the poet Christina Rossetti, who wrote a lovely poem called Remember, she had one line in it. She says, "It is better to forget and be happy rather than remember and be sad." And so all too often we tend to forget hard lessons learned in past generations. The lessons of COVID will eventually be forgotten in years and years to come. We seem to be hardwired every 20 years or so. And certainly when I've been doing this for a long time, as I know others have, some of it is just coming round again. And the point you made, Aaron, about what I call the churn rate in the C-suite, I think the average length of a CEO is something like 18 months before he or she steps down. And along with that would go with collective memory. So I think it's incumbent on all consultants who've been in this for a long time to become the collective memory of organizations who have forgotten. Because very often there's a sort of plus ça change. The more things change, they actually stay the same.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's why that on this framework, that whole that orange and red circle there, but you're understanding the environment you're operating within through your business intelligence, red team, horizon scanning, environmental awareness. Because that, as you said, Peter, and again, Paul, you're looking outside of what's going on. It's better to learn from a near miss than actually learn from the pain of it yourself.
Did right.
That's where your intelligence comes from.
Yeah, Paul, do you have any comments on that at all?
Your microphone's off, Paul.
You're mute, Paul.
Yeah. Okay, Paul, you're on mute.
We all do it.
Sorry there. You're about 3,000 plus miles to the west. The notion of resilience is still climbing, making an uphill climb. It's been slow to embrace, with the exception of a number of certain types of vertical markets, such as banking and finance, insurance, which is comparable to what's happening in the UK and Europe. The whole idea of changing culture is anathema to many companies over here. They're very, very content to stay the course if there's no problems or issues or anything like that. I work for a number of big organizations, including telecommunications companies, hospitals, insurance companies, and for those kinds of organizations, culture is a very big part of the overall milieu of the organization. And getting these kinds of changes over here, at least, it's not an easy thing to do, but it's still important to at least make the effort, and that's what we're trying to do here. So the points that Aaron and Peter are making are spot on.
Yeah, I agree as well. But just so everyone's looking for some supporting material, if you're researching or anything else, a very good friend of mine, Professor Brian Toft, supported by a guy called Simon Reynolds, wrote a book called Learning from Disasters back in 2005. And we just don't learn from events. And in fact, in the UK, for the COVID issue, back in 2016, an exercise that was carried out at a senior level recognized some of the failings that could happen of the big events themselves. But Paul, I've got a question for you, sir, here that's come up. Yeah, great, thanks. I've got it in front of me as well. Paul, just a question that's been raised here, and this is where it really comes to the rub. How much time might be needed to evolve to a culture of resilience? How much time?
How about 1,000,000 years? Now, the idea of doing what we're talking about doing is probably something that's going to take a couple of years to do. It could take months, it could take upwards of a year just to get the program together, to get top management to embrace the new direction. And as I had suggested in my notes, it might be better to do a program that does small incremental changes as opposed to trying to do a massive cultural shift. People, people over here at least tend to be very resistant to changing what they perceive their norm to be, and I think it could probably be done, but that's one of the reasons why I put the the hold on there slide in there, because it could be shot down almost immediately and never gain any traction. On the other side of it, it probably could take, I would say, at least 3 to 5 years of ongoing reinforcement, reminding employees and top management of the values, to make something like that happen. But even at that, it may be a corollary, or it may be a complementary component of a subtle change to the corporate culture, not a complete disposal of the original culture and coming up with something new, but a component that can be added to the existing culture to raise it to a new level.
Thanks, Paul.
Steve, I just
Any other
had
comments, you guys? Yeah, sorry.
Yes, Steve. So I've just had a question from Damon. I guess I pronounce his name in the questions and answers section, and he's asked, how, in the model, in the Sunburst model, where does the actual making money element of the business happen? That is making your money is an outcome of having all these things in place. So, going in and, getting the hard cash, the money, the providing the services, whatever it is your business does, cannot function if these elements here are not properly in place. Because if you're not engaging, so if I look on my right-hand side here, if I'm not looking at my stakeholder management and engagement correctly, I'm not going to be making the links to make my money or produce the engagement or have my customers. You've only got to look across in the UK, the number of high street businesses that have gone under because they weren't making the money, because they weren't engaging with their customers and the effectiveness. Likewise, if your policies aren't in place, or your frameworks aren't in place, you are fined heavily for not reaching the required legislative or regulatory requirements, be public or private. There, you're then going, you'll fail to make money. So, and then you come down to your resource. If you're not looking after your people, they're going to walk. If they walk, your company then struggles and finally goes under. So the key bit here, is I'm not saying that one of these operational resilience pieces equals making money, and making money isn't part of your operational resilience piece. All these come together, and each of these, and the outcome is making a business which can then do the operational bit of making the money or providing the service that you require. And the trouble is, most of the C-suite are worried about the bottom line, and they tend to forget that to create a bottom line, you need to have the right frameworks in place to protect and allow the organization to adapt to the environment it's operating within. And the challenge to resilience is, show me where it makes a financial difference today. And as we just discussed, organizational resilience is your 5-year plan, 5-10-year plan, and your operational resilience is putting the framework in place for your organization to function effectively, safely, and adapt, learn, and thrive when you're living in a disruptive world, in the VUCA world.
Okay, Aaron, yeah, thanks very much for that, because it sort of leads on to another question that's come in for Peter. I think it falls into your area, Peter, here, because it actually adds value to what you're saying here. The question is, can too many business silos get in the way of operational resilience?
They can. I just want to answer that in 2 parts. Just to go back very briefly, something I put on the chat just now. We'll ask about what's the best way to trigger this. Yes, lessons, but actually there's something called isomorphic learning, which you can look at very easily online, and it's a great tool, a great theory, and a practice. Don't just look in your own market sector, a crisis, a near disaster, whatever it might be, happening elsewhere beyond your region geographically or beyond your sector commercially. So something happening in retail, manufacturing, pharmaceutical, academia, some sort of disaster, some crisis nearly avoided or going on, can provide great clues. Think way outside the box to capture that. In terms of silos, I can give you an example of a particular organization that I went to, and we managed to persuade them that all these silos were working actually in competition to some extent with each other. Yes, they all had the same badge, but some of them were profit centers against profit centers, and just too many silos didn't work. And I said, yes, that's a very good idea, Peter. We think we're going to change that. And I went back about 6 weeks later to see how this project was going on. I said, yes, we've done away with silos. And I said, well, crikey, that's something. What have you got instead? Oh, we've got cylinders of excellence. All they actually ended up doing was changing the name. But many corporations, certainly the large ones, that have separate profit centers, and I've worked in these, I've been directors of them, will often pitch profit center against profit center in the mistaken belief that this is how you generate business. This is how you actually remain competitive. I disagree totally with that. The sum of the whole is worth more than its parts. The only exception to this would, I think, be in regulations such as in the finance world. There are certain regulations that prohibit the close working association of some features. We have to accept that. But generally, it's a Herculean task of the CEO, the chairman, to bring everyone together to share this and actually adopt, adapt, implement all the lessons that are learned, and not just pitch silo against silo, which can happen.
No, thanks very much for that, Peter. I'm sorry, but we've sort of run out of time here, and I'm sure if there's any questions anyone would like still to ask, if they could send to info@resilienceassociation.org, that's info@resilienceassociation.org, and I'll pass them on to each of the presenters for them to respond to you directly. Otherwise, thanks very much for attending this webinar. I know it's gone very fast, and there's so much information, as you can see, certainly from the what you've heard so far, and we've only just touched the surface. And I would hope that you will stay with us as we run further seminars over the coming months, all on organizational resilience. And again, if you wish to be kept fully in touch with this, please register on www.resilienceassociation.org. So thanks so much for attending. Thanks to the speakers. Well appreciated, well done. And thanks to all you guys who've attended. Hope to see you again soon. Good evening.